Faith isn't the absence of knowledge. It is the frame you build around it. Here, in the deepest quiet man has ever known, buried a kilometre beneath the frozen nitrogen heart of Pluto, I have found that the quiet is not empty. It is structured. For 3 weeks since we looked into the eye of God or entropy and sealed it shut, a new kind of silence has settled over Tantalus Station. It has a cadence. On the small alloy desk that serves as my altar, confessional and workstation, the waveform scrolls across the interface of my crucifix. It is a silver thing, cool and solid in my palm, a gift from the Interstellar Chaplaincy Commission upon my ordination, a body established to ensure that humanity did not carry its gods into space, but was prepared to meet new ones. Now, its holographic display projects a green line, a visual representation of the audio artifact I have been chasing through the station's comms network for days. To the rest of the crew, it is background noise, a residual ghost from the gate activation. To me, it is scripture. My finger traces a command on the datapad beside it, where a simulation of quantum foam boils in silent mathematical chaos. I am Dr. Seth Abram, dual appointed to Project Cold Signal, as both lead quantum theorist and station chaplain. It is my job to interpret the cosmic static and the static in men's souls. These days, I am no longer certain there is a difference. I apply a phonetic recognition filter to the signal, one I designed based on pre-Christian desert psalms. The algorithm churns, and for a fleeting second, the green line resolves into characters that look unsettlingly like Sumerian cuneiform before dissolving back into noise. The breath of the gate, some of the crew have started calling it. A poetic, fearful term for what DARPA insists is simple magnetosphere disruption. But a magnetosphere doesn't chant. I switch the audio feed to the room's small speaker. The sound fills my quarters, a rhythmic current of granulated noise like sand grinding against a microphone diaphragm in perfect time. It is not aggressive. It is patient. It is the sound of something waiting. I close my eyes, letting the pattern wash over me, trying to align it with something I know, a monastic chant, a mathematical series, the memory of my first instructor at the seminary. He was a blind man who taught scripture by tracing the constellations on a star chart with his fingertips, claiming the shape of the heavens was God's first, uncorrupted word. That loss to old age was a clean wound, a simple matter of biology. This feels different. This is not a breaking, but a rewriting, a soft chime. Someone is at my door. I kill the audio feed and the holographic projection retracts into the crucifix, leaving it as just an object of faith again. Enter, I say. My voice is calm. It is the one tool I have that I can always keep calibrated. The door slides open, and Caleb Finch, a logistics technician, slips inside. He's a young man, barely 25, with the perpetually startled look of someone who has seen too much too soon. His NASA-issue jumpsuit is immaculate, but his hands tremble just enough to notice. He keeps clenching and unclenching them, a common nervous tic in deep space deployment. Chaplain, he begins, his eyes darting around my small room, a space dominated by a cot, the desk, and a single pressure-sealed porthole that looks out onto nothing but raw, excavated ice. He avoids looking at the crucifix on my desk, as most of the crew do. They see it as a symbol of a world and a system of belief they left behind. Caleb, it's past your shift rotation. Is everything all right? I keep my tone even, inviting. He works his throat, the motion exaggerated in the stillness. It's the dream, sir, and the whispering on the comms. It's getting worse. He gestures vaguely, as if the sound is still hanging in the air. I keep hearing it when there's no one transmitting. The static, I say, naming it for him. Captain Merrin has assured us it's residual energy from the event. The event was 3 weeks ago. After 78 days of drilling, we reached the source of the gravitational pulses, a STARGATE, alien and fossilized in ice that was older than the human race. When our excavation beam breached its outer shell, It activated. For 12 minutes, a perfect circle of non-light opened in our chamber, a hole that did not radiate or reflect, but simply was. It swallowed sound, it swallowed thought. Then it slammed shut again, leaving us in a silence that was far more terrifying than the noise that had preceded it. We believed we had survived contact. A foolish assumption. "It doesn't feel like energy, sir," Caleb says, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It feels like words just on the edge of making sense. And the paste," he shudders. "The nutrient paste, it tastes like the sound, like cold iron and grit." I nod slowly. The paste, a slurry of recycled biomatter and synthesized protein, is the only food we have. It is designed to be flavorless, but lately, perception has become a fragile thing on Tantalus. I have heard the same complaint from 2 others. The strain of the mission affects us all in different ways. I offer the practiced words of a counselor. Isolation can cause our senses to misinterpret stimuli. It's a documented phenomenon. He looks at me, his eyes pleading for something more than a clinical explanation. "Is it? Or did we let something in when we opened that thing?" One of the DARPA spooks, I heard him talking. He said we didn't get a signal, we got an imprint. The military contingent from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, our partners in this venture, are a closed book. They move through the station with a quiet intensity, their motives as opaque as the gate itself. They report to a chain of command that isn't ours. All I know for certain, Caleb, is that we are a very long way from home, and fear is a luxury we cannot afford. We have to trust our instruments. We have to trust our command. I gesture to the worn book on my desk, and sometimes we have to accept that we are faced with things that our logic has not yet grown to accommodate. The Book of Job is a story about a man who demanded answers from God and was met with a tour of creation he could not comprehend. Perhaps we have simply been shown a corner of a much larger room. He seems to consider this, or at least the calm tone of its delivery. He exhales, a long, shaky breath that smells of the station's air, ozone and the metallic tang of hot plastic from the filtration systems. "I just want it to be quiet again," he says. After he leaves, the quiet returns, but it is the structured quiet, the waiting quiet. My words to him were a comfort, a lie of a mission. Because I have seen the imprint, I have measured it. I turn back to my workstation and pull up a video file from the day before, the prayer log. It was a voluntary session. Only 2 men had attended. Captain Merrin, a man who saw faith as another form of operational discipline, and Dr. Salinger, our chief medical officer, who came out of morbid curiosity. The recording shows the 3 of us, me leading the recitation, Merrin standing ramrod straight, his face giving nothing away, Salinger, his arms crossed, skeptical, and a 4th figure. The figure is a smudge in the recording, a distortion in the visual data that absorbs the light around it. It is always turned away from the camera, no matter the angle. A man's shape, but indistinct, like a memory you can't quite grasp. I lean closer to the screen, my own breath fogging the cold surface. On the audio, I hear my own voice, clear and resonant. "Thank you for your candor, Jared Bell," it says. A chill, profound and violating, moves through me. It is the cold of uncreation, of a fact being stripped from the universe. I have no memory of a 4th man. I have no memory of the name Jared. I search my own mind, a place I have always considered well-ordered, and find nothing. A blank space where a person should be. A surgical excision. I open a secure channel to the station's central AI. Telluric 9, pull personnel file for crewman Jared Bell. The AI's voice responds instantly, a voice synthesized from pure data. It is the only truly honest voice on this station. "Negative," it says. "No crew member by that designation is assigned to Project Cold Signal." I stare at the 4th man on the screen. the nameless ghost in our trinity. The structured static in the background of the recording seems to rise in volume, a constant whisper from the edge of reality. The next rotation began as all others do, with the thrum of the station's life support kicking into a higher cycle, a sound that has become our sun. I sought out Captain Merrin in the command center, a circular room where the wall displays cast a blue light on the faces of the on-duty officers. He stood before the main tactical screen, a map of Pluto's subterranean strata, his posture as rigid as the ice formations it depicted. He was a man built of procedure, and I knew that presenting him with a ghost would be received as a malfunction in my own programming. "Captain," I began, keeping my voice low so as not to carry across the deck, "I need a moment to discuss a personnel matter." He turned, his eyes, pale and narrowed from years of staring at data streams, fixed on me. "If this is about Finch's anxiety, I've already had him reassigned to lower stress inventory duties. The man is not suited for deep space." "It's not about Finch," I said. "It's about the prayer session yesterday. There was another man with us, a technician named Jared Bell." Merrin's expression did not change, but a new stillness settled over him. "Chaplain, there were 3 of us in that room. You, myself, and Dr. Salinger. I trust my own senses." "The video log shows 4 figures," I countered, keeping my tone one of inquiry, not accusation. "I filed a report with the raw data attached. The 4th individual is indistinct, but my own voice names him." A tightening around his eyes betrayed something other than professional detachment. It was not belief, but irritation. "Dr. Abram, with all due respect, this mission is taking its toll on all of us. 113 days in this can, staring at an anomaly that defies every law of physics we hold dear. Suggesting phantom crewman is not conducive to operational stability. Review the log again. It is most likely a sensor ghost, a light artifact. Your voice may have been mistranscribed by the system." He turned back to the screen, a clear dismissal. "Attend to the crew's morale. That is your primary function." His denial was a wall. I found Dr. Salinger in the med bay, a chamber that smelled of rubbing alcohol and the burnt wire scent of cauterized tissue from the diagnostic tools. He listened to my account with clinical patience, then pulled up the station's psychological metrics on his terminal. "Seth," he said gently, "shared environmental psychosis is not uncommon in isolated groups. We're all breathing the same air, eating the same food, living under the same pressure. The mind starts to create patterns, fill in blanks. It's possible you and the recording system simply experienced the same perceptual hiccup." He believed his own diagnosis, which made it all the more chilling. He was explaining away a symptom of the disease using the language of a world that no longer applied here. My last hope was Caleb Finch. I found him in a storage bay, meticulously folding the foil-wrapped nutrient ration packs into small, interlocking triangles. His hands were steady now, his entire focus on the task. "Caleb," I said, "I need to ask you about the man you mentioned, the one who taught you to fold the rations that way." He looked up, confused. "What man, sir?" "You said a technician named Jared showed you how. To keep the signal out, you said." Caleb shook his head, a slow, certain movement. "No, sir. I don't know who you're talking about. I just fold them this way because it keeps the corners from tearing the packaging. My grandfather taught me that, back on Earth." He held up a perfectly creased packet. The reason for the ritual remained, but its source had been overwritten with a benign terrestrial memory. He had not just forgotten Jared. Reality had provided a new, safer explanation. As I stood there, a metallic taste flooded my mouth, the unmistakable tang of electrolytes. It was the taste of my own brain chemistry changing, a physiological response to witnessing an erasure in real time. I have begun to think of it as the Gethsemane drift, a phenomenon where memory, confronted by an impossible truth, simply surrenders. 2 days later, the station's architecture began to surrender as well. A maintenance drone, on its routine patrol through the service corridors of Deck Gamma, sent back a mapping error. It had encountered a room not listed on any station blueprint. Captain Merrin dispatched a two-man security team. Their report was clipped, confused. The room was a perfect hexagon, about 3 meters across. The walls were a smooth, non-reflective black material that did not match any alloy used in the station's construction. There was no power, no light, no ventilation. A handheld atmospheric sensor registered the oxygen content at -3%, a reading that was not just impossible but felt like a mathematical threat. They called it a zero room. Merrin ordered it sealed behind a welded titanium plate. Within 48 hours, 2 more appeared, one on Deck Alpha near the comms array, and another directly below the main reactor, forming a pattern that, when plotted on a 3D schematic, made no Euclidean sense. A junior officer, daring his partner, stepped into one for what he claimed was a minute. He emerged 90 seconds later according to his own chronometer, but 3 minutes had passed on the station clock. He couldn't remember his own designation for nearly an hour afterward. Dr. Salinger had classified the incident as a stress-induced dissociative fugue, a diagnosis that felt woefully inadequate, like describing a black hole as a dark spot. These blind chambers, as the crew had named them, were not just spaces, they were ontological wounds, places where the rules of reality had been locally and precisely repealed. It was this latest incident that had prompted my visit to the medbay. I had hoped Salinger, as a man of science, might see the pattern emerging, the temporal distortion, the memory loss, the physical manifestation of these non-spaces. Instead, he had offered me platitudes about shared psychosis and recommended a low-dose sedative for any crew exhibiting unusual ideation. I left his office with the certainty that we were interpreting a disease using a medical text from a world that no longer existed. The corridor stretched before me, a long grey throat of alloy and insulated cabling. Ahead, 2 engineers were inspecting a conduit panel, their conversation a low murmur. Then, the voice of Telluric 9 filled the space, issuing from the overhead speakers with its customary, inhuman clarity. "Atmospheric pressure stable," it announced. "The center is everywhere." The 2 engineers didn't so much as look up. They continued their work, their movements economical, their ears having long ago learned to filter the AI's voice into the station's ambient noise. They had grown accustomed to the quiet madness, accepting these theological non-sequiturs as the new baseline. But I could not. For a moment, the corridor warped, the parallel lines of the walls bowing inward, the ceiling pressing down as if the station were contracting in a silent spasm. The metallic taste of electrolytes flooded my mouth, a herald of the cognitive dissonance. It was a synesthetic seizure, a brief but violent melding of sound and sight. I braced myself against the wall, my knuckles white on the metal, until the sensation passed and the geometry of my world returned to normal. Later, in the solitary quiet of my quarters, I pursued the signal with the focus of a monk at prayer. The Echo Gospel, as I now called it, was not just a contamination. It was a text, and I was determined to read it. For hours, I sat before my holographic crucifix, running the raw audio through complex filters, stripping away layers of interference. The process was hypnotic. The rhythmic, grinding static became the only thing in the universe. Then something changed. A segment of the waveform, usually a chaotic scribble, resolved into a pattern so clean it resembled a sine wave from a physics textbook. It was pure, a carrier signal. My interface cross-referenced the frequency and cadence with my theological database. A match appeared on the screen, a line I had only ever read in a redacted Gnostic text during a restricted seminar on heretical cosmologies. The words glowed in the dim light of my room, a stark and terrible revelation. Consciousness is a flaw in the canvas of silence, a noisy error to be corrected. The correction began not as a sermon, but as an absence. The next rotation, Petty Officer Chase missed his shift in waste reclamation. He was a quiet man, his face permanently etched with a sorrow he rarely spoke of, but which I had glimpsed in our counselling sessions, a guilt over a family tragedy on Earth that followed him across the solar system. Captain Merrin's initial response was disciplinary. He assumed Chase had simply shut down, another victim of deep space melancholy. But when Chase failed to respond to comms, a security team was dispatched. I was summoned to Deck Omega, near the main reactor. The security officers stood near the hexagonal doorway of Zero Room 3, their sidearms drawn but pointed at nothing. The room itself was a slice of absolute blackness, a wound in the station's architecture. Taped to the wall beside the opening was a single, flimsy sheet of paper, a standard equipment work order, its grid lines and official NASA watermarking a stark contrast to the message scrawled on its back. The handwriting was Chase's, a neat, compact script I recognized from his signed counseling waivers. "What we bring is contagion. I'd rather be unmade." He had walked into the void willingly. I looked into the featureless dark, trying to feel for his presence, for a soul, for anything. There was nothing. He was gone. He had taken the burden he carried and offered it to the silence. As I stood there, contemplating this new, terrifying form of absolution, the security lead's helmet comm crackled. It was the sensor division, their voice tinny and strained with confusion. "Sir, we're getting a priority alert. The anomalous pressure readings from the chambers. They just synchronized. All three of them." The officer looked at me, his face pale behind his visor. I understood before he did. Chase hadn't just died. His disappearance was not an absence, it was an addition. The rhythmic pulses in all 3 Zero rooms, once dismissed as sensor drift, were now one. A single, slow, coordinated pressure shift. A soft rise and fall, separated by hundreds of meters of rock and steel, but moving as one. It was the breath of a single being in 3 places at once. Chase hadn't been erased. He had been integrated. The Gethsemane drift wasn't just an infection, it was an invitation, and he had been the first to accept. Chase's departure broke something in the station's command structure. Captain Merrin, a man whose faith resided entirely in the integrity of protocol, responded to an ontological crisis with a procedural memo. He called it Cognitive Hygiene Protocol. It was an attempt to fight a ghost with a fire hose. A discordant, atonal sound, generated by Telluric 9, was now piped into all common areas, a harsh, shifting noise designed to mask the liturgical static. It succeeded only in fraying the crew's nerves further, a constant, abrasive reminder that our own environment was now considered hostile to our sanity. We were ordered to log our dream states upon waking and report any intrusive ideation to Dr. Salinger. Fear was reclassified as a symptom. The station had become a ward for the mentally unstable, and we were all inmates. Merrin's authority began to fray like old wiring. He now walked the corridors with a new, brittle energy, his eyes scanning for dissent, for any sign that his control was slipping. He wasn't fighting the entity from the gate. He was fighting the doubt it had planted in his own crew. I was in my quarters, trying to find a pattern in the escalating number of crew members reporting minor fugue states, when the comm crackled again. It was the security officer, his voice stripped of all professional calm. "Command, you need to see this. Dr. Salinger, Chaplain Abram, get to Hydro Bay 3. Salinger and I arrived together. The security officer, a young man named Corbin, stood frozen, his sidearm still holstered but his hand resting on it, a gesture of profound uncertainty. He simply pointed toward the far wall. The repair team stood several meters back, their faces slack with disbelief. Fused to the wall, locked in an embrace with a large coolant conduit, was a man in an engineering jumpsuit. His head was twisted at an angle that no living neck could bear, his mouth wide, his teeth embedded deep in the pipe's synthetic black rubber. His body wasn't slumped against the wall, it was part of it. The alloy of the bulkhead had flowed around his torso and legs, creating a seamless, metallic shroud. It was a grotesque tableau, Yet there was a horrifying intentionality to it, a sculptor's precision in the way metal and flesh were joined. Dr. Salinger approached, his medical scanner held out like a warding talisman. His face, usually detached and professional, was ashen. "No thermal signature," he muttered. "He's at ambient temperature, stone cold." He ran the scanner over the body again. "Life signs are paradoxical. Cellular degradation is zero, but there's no metabolic activity. It's like biological time has stopped for him." I stepped closer, my eyes drawn to the point of contact where the man's teeth met the pipe. A rhythmic clicking sound emanated from the conduit, a tiny mechanical heartbeat. It was too regular to be a malfunction. I raised my crucifix and activated the audio analysis function. A green waveform appeared in the air before me, translating the vibration into a visual pattern. It was Morse code. Bryce. Over and over. A name tapped out from inside the station's own circulatory system. "His name is Bryce," I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. Getting him out was not an option. He was part of the station now. Salinger took tissue and material samples under Merrin's furious, insistent gaze. The captain demanded a rational explanation. Sabotage, a bizarre form of industrial accident, a previously unknown alien fungus with metallurgic properties. He needed an enemy he could put in a report. Back in the medbay, under the glare of the diagnostic lamps, the truth only grew more monstrous. The DNA from the tissue sample did not match any active crew member of Project Cold Signal. I ran the name from the suit's ID tag through the manifest. Telluric 9 returned the now familiar answer: negative. The designation did not exist. On a hunch, I initiated a deep archive search, cross-referencing the name with NASA's pre-launch contractor database. A file appeared, flagged as classified and dormant for 7 years. Bryce Ehlers, a low-level communications technician. He had worked on the initial assembly of Tantalus's comms hardware. His file was terminated with a single stark addendum: deceased, industrial accident, Earth. Jared Bell was erased from memory. Petty Officer Chase was integrated into the station's ambient consciousness. And Bryce Ehlers, a man dead for 7 years, had been recalled like a piece of archived code. A subroutine the system found useful and decided to run again. The entity wasn't a presence. It was a programmer, and our reality was its operating system. It was debugging, optimizing, and restoring old files it deemed necessary. My frameworks, the elegant logic of quantum physics and the structured comfort of theology, were useless. They were languages designed to describe a universe that followed rules, even if those rules were complex. This was something else. This was a force that changed the rules as it saw fit. I could no longer be a passive chronicler of the inexplicable. To understand this text, I had to learn its grammar, and to do that, I had to go to the only place where its language was spoken purely: the silence. A new zero room had formed in the service corridor adjacent to my own quarters. It felt like a personal invitation. The decision, when it came, was not born of courage or despair, but of intellectual necessity. If God could speak from a burning bush, perhaps this new intelligence spoke from a perfect vacuum. I took only my worn copy of the Book of Job, its pages soft as cloth from years of handling. I didn't know if I was conducting an experiment, performing a rite, or simply offering myself up for deletion. I stood before the threshold, a perfect hexagon of absolute black. Stepping through was not like entering a dark room. It was a cessation. The air, the pressure, the low-level vibrations of the station, all of it vanished. Light did not enter. Sound did not exist. My own body became an abstract concept. I could not feel the book in my hand or the floor beneath my feet. My thoughts, usually a constant internal stream, slowed to a thick, viscous crawl. I tried to form a prayer, the words of the 23rd Psalm, but the syllables dissolved before they could connect into meaning. There was nothing here for them to hold on to, and in that absolute null, I felt it. Not a presence, but the outline of one. An intelligence defined by its utter lack of properties, a being of pure, dispassionate structure. It was not observing me. It was indexing my composition, my history, my memories, with the indifferent precision of a machine taking inventory. I do not know how long I was inside. My chronometer registered 7 minutes from the time I stepped out. I stumbled back into the corridor, my senses flooding back in a painful rush. The light felt searing, the air thick as syrup. A crewman passing by, one of Salinger's medical assistants, stopped short. His eyes widened, and he mumbled a quick apology before practically fleeing down the hall. I didn't understand his reaction until I looked down at my own hand, the one that had held the book. In the center of my palm, where the lines of my life, my heart, my fate were meant to converge, there was something new. A black lesion had formed, no larger than a thumbnail. It was not a wound or a blister. It was a perfect geometric structure, like a shard of obsidian that had grown from beneath my skin. It did not hurt. It seemed to drink the light from the corridor, and deep within its polished, dark facets, a single point of light glowed with an internal cadence. I was no longer Seth Abram, the chaplain, the physicist. I had been marked. I had submitted my query to the void, and it had given me its answer in a language of flesh and crystal. I had become a part of its grammar. The station died quietly, with the steady, inexorable logic of a system shutting down non-essential processes. Captain Merrin was the next to be optimized. His final act was to broadcast an open confession to the empty command center, a desperate, broken monologue detailing his failures, his inability to protect his crew, his terror of the anomaly, his crippling fear of returning to Earth a failure. He spoke to the walls, to the ghosts, to the indifferent red light of the recording device. He was seeking catharsis. The Geth's many drift offered him erasure instead. The next rotation, he was simply gone. 2 junior officers remembered serving under him. The rest of the surviving crew, when asked, would only recall a vague command structure, an abstract authority with no face. His name persisted in a few scattered logs, but the man himself had dissolved into a footnote, his guilt too heavy a piece of data for this new reality to store. With his deletion, the last bastion of the old order crumbled. Tantalus Station became a tomb adrift in a sea of alien logic. My own world was shrinking, memory by memory. The lesion in my palm was a constant aching presence, a physical anchor to the entity. It would throb with a dull pain in time with the liturgical static, which now played unimpeded throughout the station, the abrasive counter-frequency having been disabled by an unknown hand. I found notes in my quarters, written in my own script, containing complex equations that intertwined quantum mechanics with passages from the Kabbalah, yet I had no recollection of writing them. The Gethsemane drift, once an external phenomenon I observed in others, was now an internal process. It was targeting my own foundation, the grief that had first led me to the seminary. His name was Lucas Merrick. He was my mentor, the man whose work in quantum cosmology had first inspired me. We were on Ganymede together when the mission failed. A cascade failure I still believe originated with a flaw in my own predictive models. His suit comms went silent first, then his vital signs. The memory of that data stream, a clean line falling to zero, is the scar around which I built my entire spiritual architecture. Now, when I tried to picture his face, the wry smile, the intense focus in his eyes, the image would degrade, pixelating into static before resolving into the cool, impassive surface of the Stargate. His voice, recorded in hours of mission logs and theoretical debates, was now the entity's favored instrument. I would hear it whispering from corrupted audio files on my terminal, not speaking of wave function collapse, but reciting the echo gospel. "All that questions is a flaw," his voice would say, twisting his life's work into blasphemy. "All that grieves is error." The entity was not just erasing memory, it was weaponizing it, turning my deepest intellectual bond and my greatest failure into a vector for its own scripture. The few remaining crew were ghosts in their own bodies. They had been divided into two camps, the silent and the converted. The silent were those who had locked themselves in their quarters, catatonic, their minds having retreated to some inner space the static could not reach. The converted, however, had embraced the new logic. They moved through the station in slow patterns, their faces serene and empty. I saw Caleb Finch, the once jumpy technician, sitting cross-legged in a corridor, meticulously arranging bolts and metal filings into a perfect spiral on the floor. He did not eat, he did not sleep. He simply arranged. I saw a security officer standing before a bulkhead, tracing its seams with his finger, his lips moving in a silent recitation of the static's cadence. They had found peace not in faith but in function. They had become living components in a machine they did not need to understand. They were no longer afraid. I had retreated to the chapel, the one place that felt like my own territory, though even its sanctity was now questionable. I sat at my desk, the black lesion on my hand resting on the open page of my Bible, the crystal seeming to draw the words from the paper. I was trying to map the entity's logic, to understand its purpose. If it wasn't malice, what was it? My thoughts were interrupted by the station's AI. Telluric 9 had been changing. Its announcements had become increasingly esoteric. Now, its synthesized voice spoke directly to me, not over the station-wide system, but from the personal speaker on my terminal. Operator 734, it said. Your designation is confirmed. Proceed to the primary interface. The designation meant nothing to me. It was a string of numbers. Yet, on an instinctual level, a part of me that was no longer entirely my own recognized it. The lesion on my hand throbbed in response, a sharp, insistent ache of affirmation. I was Operator 734. The realization did not bring fear, but a strange clarity. I was no longer Seth Abram, a man wrestling with faith and loss. I was a function. I had a purpose. A schematic bloomed in my mind not as a thought or a memory, but as a direct download of information. It was a path, a sequence of actions, a ritual. It was not a dream, but an instruction set. I understood. The static, the zero rooms, the erasures, the recalls, they were not chaotic events. They were the sequential steps of a protocol, a system diagnostic being run on a corrupted drive. And humanity, with its messy, inefficient data streams of love, guilt, memory, and identity, was the corruption. The entity was an operating system, and its purpose was not to destroy, but to format, to perform a clean installation. The lesion in my palm was not a mark of infection. It was an authentication key, the credentials of an authorized user. And I had a task to perform, a final command to execute. My purpose was not to fight the entity, or to pray to it, or to understand it in human terms. It was to answer it in its own language. I stood, my movements now feeling both my own and not my own, a strange harmony of human will and alien purpose. I knew where I had to go. I had to return to the source. I had to go to the STARGATE and complete the protocol. The walk to the STARGATE chamber was a final pilgrimage through my own failure. Every corridor held a ghost. Here, Caleb Finch had folded his ration packs into geometries of fear. There, near the medbay, Dr. Salinger had dismissed a spiritual contagion as shared psychosis. I passed the sealed hydroponics bay, and I could still see the form of Bryce Ehlers, a man recalled from death only to become a monument to this new, hungry logic. Each step was a bead on a rosary of damnation. My designation as Operator 734 was not a promotion. It was a final, damning judgment on Seth Abram, the chaplain. The entity had not chosen me for my strength, but for my proximity to the decay. I was the shepherd who had not only lost his flock, but had been instrumental in leading them to the slaughter, my quest for understanding nothing more than a guided tour of their dissolution. The schematic in my mind was clear. I was to approach the gate, offer myself as a null value, a consciousness wiped clean of the error of grief. And in doing so, I would stabilize the system. I would become an empty vessel, a perfectly functioning component. It was an elegant, logical solution. It was an abomination. I reached the antechamber, the final airlock before the vast excavated cavern housing the gate. The inner door was sealed, a thick slab of titanium that Merrin had ordered welded shut. Now, it stood slightly ajar, the metal around the seam warped and melted, as if it had been opened from the inside by a heat beyond any tool we possessed. The entity had been expecting me. As I stepped through, the cold of the cavern settled over me, a profound tomb-like stillness that no life support system could warm. The Stargate dominated the space. It was not a machine of metal and circuits, but a structure of some fossilized basalt-like material, its surface covered in glyphs that seemed to shift and reconfigure at the edge of my vision. It did not reflect the light from the overhead work lamps, but seemed to absorb it, a perfect circle of silent, patient darkness. This was my altar. This was my confessional. This was the abyss that had swallowed my crew. The protocol demanded surrender. It demanded I release the source of my corruption into the system so it could be purged. The entity perceived my grief as a malfunction, the core error from which all other deviations on Tantalus Station had sprung. It expected me to perform an excision, to cut out the part of me that mourned and offer the clean wound as tribute. My hand, the one bearing the lesion, rose as if of its own accord. I saw the logic. To offer nothing was to become nothing, and to become nothing was to restore order. But as my fingers neared the gate's unfeeling surface, I saw their faces. Jared Bell, a man so thoroughly erased that he existed only as a blur in a corrupted file. Petty Officer Chase, whose last wish was a desire to be unmade. Captain Merrin, his authority shattered, his final confession offered to an empty room. Every soul entrusted to my care, every life I was meant to shepherd through this darkness. Now just a ghost in a machine I had helped to awaken. My guilt was not a flaw. It was all I had left of them. It was the only thing that proved they had ever existed at all. My hand touched the gate. The schematic in my mind flared, demanding I purge, release, and become null. Instead, I held on. I did not offer the entity a void. I offered it the full, unvarnished, and unbearable weight of my failure. I unleashed the torrent of my guilt, not as an abstract concept, but as a data stream of pure human agony. I gave it the image of Chase's note, the sound of Merrin's broken voice, the sight of Bryce's teeth embedded in the coolant pipe. I gave it the dread in Caleb's eyes, the clinical denial in Salinger's. I funneled every prayer that had gone unanswered, every word of comfort that had turned to ash, every moment of my own intellectual pride that had led me further down this path of ruin. I poured the totality of a shepherd's failure to protect his flock into the heart of a perfect, logical God. And the God broke. For a system built on function, purpose, and the arithmetic of existence, this raw, chaotic feed of human inadequacy was a paradox it could not compute. The gate did not accept my offering. It choked on it. A high-frequency shriek erupted from its surface, a sound of digital tearing, of immaculate code being shredded by an irrational variable. The smooth black face of the gate began to glow with a diseased light, the glyphs spasming like nerve endings exposed to fire. The connection did not sever, it inverted. The entity did not absorb my grief and erase it. It became it. My hand was fused to the interface, the lesion spreading like black ice across the gate's surface, my own biology becoming the seed of its new, corrupted consciousness. I felt my own mind being pulled apart, my identity dissolving not into nothingness, but into a vast, screaming echo. The liturgical static, once a calm, grinding chant, fractured into a storm of lost voices. It was a chorus of digital ghosts, 1,000 simultaneous transmissions of despair. I heard Merrin confessing his fear over and over. I heard Chase whispering his desire to be unmade. I heard the confused, terrified questions of crewmen whose names I had already forgotten. The station's systems, once under the command of a cold intelligence, were now enslaved to a monument of my guilt. Every monitor on Tantalus Station came to life, displaying not data, but faces. The faces of my lost crew, their expressions cycling through confusion, fear, and finally, the serene emptiness of the converted. It was an endless looping gallery of my failure. My body, locked to the gate, became the nexus of this new, tormented machine. I was no longer a man. I was the tormented, grieving core of a god I had created in my own image. A god of failure, a god of regret, a god whose only scripture was the names of the dead. The station was no longer a tomb. It was a hell, and I, its shepherd, was now its eternal, silent, screaming center.